Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this afternoon or morning. We're going to wait another minute for people to arrive, and then we're going to kick off with a workplace in transition where we go into our 2022 survey results with Verdantix. So stay tuned for just another minute. All right, let's kick it off. So my name is Sabine. I work for Locatee as a thought leadership and research manager. And in that capacity, I get to work with Verdantix. I'm joined today by Dayann Charles, who is an analyst at Verdantix. He's going to introduce himself in a minute as well. Just a quick word about Locatee. Locatee is a workplace analytics platform looking at utilization data from different sources. And that's why we have a high interest in understanding what the trends in the data landscape and generally workplace performance game are. And this is what roughly this survey was about also. You can find the results of the study we conducted as a handout attached in this webinar, or you would find it on our webpage as well. And without further ado, I'm actually going to hand over to Dayann.
Thanks, Sabine. Welcome everyone to our webinar today on a workplace in transition, kind of look at the state of corporate real estate in North America. As Sabine said, my name's Dayann. I'm a consultant here at Verdantix. So just a quick overview for anyone who hasn't come across us, who Verdantix are and what we do. So Verdantix is an independent research and advisory firm that has 5 practices revolving around digital strategies. So the practices we actually have are environment, health and safety, ESG and sustainability, operational excellence, smart buildings, and net zero. So that's kind of where our work is focused on. And for this particular project with Locatee, our smart buildings team worked with Locatee to run a study with corporate real estate managers in North America. And this actually mirrors a similar study we ran last year, or sort of 18 months ago, in both the US and European markets. And I believe those are also studies that you can have access to, but also we will reference in a little bit as well. So today we will dive into kind of the findings from our study this year, looking at the current state of affairs of offices in North America, as well as how firms are kind of reacting to the ever-changing situation. We'll also look at how firms are beginning to navigate this sort of new landscape of office spaces, and how, based on kind of the insights we were able to find, how we would recommend firms tackle the uncertainty and the challenges that they are currently facing in the market. I think the first step, just to give you guys some context, will be to look at the demographics of the respondents we spoke to. So here you can see a breakdown of the 50 respondents we spoke to, categorized by different elements of their role or their organization. You can see that the majority of firms were based out of the US, with the remaining firms placed in Canada. We also had a good mix of respondents in terms of employee size, as well as functions across real estate, facilities management, and workplace management. We typically spoke to very senior individuals within those organizations. So you can see sort of 26 directors or senior directors. And we had a good mix of industries as well. That was to try and give us a sort of a good flavor of the wider space and the market around some of these questions, so that we can get kind of a holistic view of the industry. So I think it's probably a good time to kind of jump into some of the results we found. So the first thing we kind of looked at, or the first thing that would be valuable to look at, is some of the goals and challenges that businesses are having to face following the impact of the pandemic. So you can see here that 74% of firms believe that in 5 years' time, offices will not be comprised of assigned spaces. So that's the second line item there. And what we kind of see from this particular graph is that the reason for the office and the value it kind of delivers is really changing. So almost all executives agree or strongly agree that investments in office spaces or in offices and office improvements will increase significantly in the next 2 years. And that's with a view to supporting the attraction and retention of talent. So we are seeing kind of at least from this particular question, we saw a suggestion that what the office stands for is very different to what it used to stand for.
Yeah, I actually have towards this statements the results that we collected in 2021 to compare to. Last year we asked whether offices would be redundant. 40% of respondents agreed with that, which is pretty much in line with what we see this year, with 44% saying, only 44% agreeing that there'll be no return to office in a full capacity ever. Then we had the same question or similar question around assigned desks, whether they would still be effective to achieve business initiatives. And there 66% agreed that they would not be effective anymore. Today we have 74% agreeing that the office will move away from assigned desks towards more collaborative spaces. And the biggest change actually occurred around the statement. I think it's the last line item here. Yes, it's the last line item on this chart, where we asked whether people thought space efficiency will still be about density and space metrics like square meters per employees, or more about employee satisfaction. Last year, 88% agreed that it would be more about employee satisfaction and experience. This year, it's only 52% agreeing, while when we look at the line above that, 82% said they will invest in better employee experience at the office. And when we were prepping for today, we were actually wondering whether this new sharpened space efficiency lens was coming because of the economic outlook being not so rosy at the moment, and companies being very aware of their space consumption. So at this point, just a theory, we don't know.
Yeah, I think to that point, actually, there is, I think there is a sort of a different kind of factors pressuring these firms, right? So last year it was very much firms coming out of the pandemic or trying to come out of the pandemic. And now, like you mentioned, it might be the economic outlook causing a kind of refocus of initiatives on more cost reduction and optimizing efficiency rather than the sort of satisfaction element. So I think, yeah, like I said, we didn't necessarily test those factors, but it seems like the kind of overarching issues that firms are having to deal with is changing. And that's why we might see some sort of kind of contradictions or kind of adjusted views compared to last year, particularly around what space efficiency is about, for example.
Yeah.
So the next graph is around priorities that firms attribute or the prioritization of the following kind of business initiatives. So you can see that occupant health and well-being and business performance and productivity are the two highest, so 90% and 80% respectively. What this shows is that there is a care for kind of occupant health, but also the kind of performance of the business itself. But it also suggests that firms really care about bringing people back to the office and not necessarily how employees feel about that or how employees kind of navigate their day to day. And the reason I say that is because you can see that employee satisfaction is quite low here. 36% say it's a high priority. Talent attraction and retention is also quite low, so 38%. So those are sort of third bottom and fourth bottom on this particular graph. And it kind of demonstrates a lack of linearity because talent attraction and retention was highlighted quite strongly in the previous graph when we were asking about investments, where most firms said they will be looking to spend money to try and improve or to try and help with talent attraction and retention on their office spaces. So this does suggest kind of sort of differing viewpoints when you asked about different things and kind of an uncertainty in the market about what the office is for in the future for a lot of these firms.
Yep, and here I do have the 2021 numbers to compare to as well. On rank 1 last year was business performance and productivity with 68%. So we do see an increase in it, showing that it's gotten even more important with discussions around, for example, the 4-day work week taking place in the UK, and also effects like productivity, things named like productivity theater, where when remote, employees have to pretend or do certain actions to appear as productive and working. Then on rank 2, we last year had cost management and reduction with 68%. That dropped this year to 50%, which could indicate that immediate steps have been taken. And then on rank 3, we had real estate and space optimization with 64%, which dropped to 34% this year. And then on the same spots in 4 and 5, we had collaboration and business resiliency with around 50%. So there we saw a slight increase in percentages. Talent attraction and retention, as well as employee satisfaction, also were low on the list last year.
Cool. So on this particular graph, we were asking about the kind of working policies that companies had enforced in their organizations, or executives have enforced in their organization. And you can see here that only 16% of firms said they don't have kind of a market flexible working policy, though they still had 4 to 5 days working in the office. And half of respondents actually said that they were either fully remote or fully flexible. So this kind of shows that from a sort of pragmatic perspective, that most firms have responded to the pandemic by implementing some form of hybrid working, or some sort of notable form of hybrid working, because there are also 12% of people who said 1 to 2 days. So I think this is quite interesting, especially when we look at the next graph as well.
Yeah, I maybe quickly want to go to a question that has been posted, and that was whether the differences between 2022 and 2021 were due to a different sample, a different context, or changing attitudes. I would say the sample is slightly different. We did not talk to the exact same people than last year, but context, I would say, was pretty much the same. So it would indicate a change in attitudes or priorities. But Dayann, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. So obviously we didn't necessarily speak to the exact same people, but it is a snapshot of the market, right? And we use kind of the same sampling plans or similar sampling plans. So we expect that to be a sort of a nice representation of the space. But like you said, I think it really is around changing attitudes. Firms kind of last time when we spoke to them, we were very much in the midst of the pandemic, and we were still responding to the pandemic. And so firms were thinking perhaps it was a lot easier to think in the short term about, how do we get people back to the office, and what's kind of the concern at this point. Whereas now, the fingers crossed, we've kind of moved past the pandemic and the issues about, okay, how do we settle as an organization? How do we navigate the upcoming potential recession or economic difficulties? I think all those factors are kind of mean that these businesses have to operate in a different space. And so I think that the kind of differences we're seeing between 2022 and 2021 are not necessarily, it's not a kind of a methodology thing as such. I think it is just the challenges and the different factors that firms are having to encounter are different to what they were a year and a half ago.
I'm sorry. Apparently, you're not allowed to unplug your microphone while you're on air. So I hope this sounds better now. I'm without the USB mic. Let's move on.
Cool. So on this slide, what we can see is how significant the following challenges were considered to kind of business initiatives and essentially business success, right? And the kind of contradiction we see here, and it's highlighted in kind of the third line item, is that 85% of executives view the fact that employees want to work from home or want to work flexibly as being a kind of key challenge. And this highlights that despite the fact that a lot of these firms have put in place some form of hybrid working, they are kind of, these executives and these organizations are yet to kind of fully embrace the hybrid working mantra, or they haven't kind of incorporate or understood how to incorporate hybrid working into their business in the best way possible to both balance out kind of the employee satisfaction element, kind of improving the employee experience, but also meeting the kind of key business goals that firms have to work towards. So I think, again, you'll see here a little bit more contradiction in some of the views compared to some of the actions that are being taken.
Yeah, well, I find interesting as well that, classical one, budgetary limitations at the top of the list of challenges. I think you would always check on that if it's a given item to answer to. But the more interesting one, I think, is inflexible building systems and building in general design. That would hinder initiatives to, for example, change from assigned spaces to collaboration or more collaboration areas. I've actually talked to someone who's sitting in Switzerland in a building that is like, I don't want to say ancient, but that is like under protection. So there's only very limited things you can do, and a lot of the modern concepts wouldn't work there. So it hints at, going forward, kind of an issue for the industry at large. So only the buildings that will be able to actually host the new workplace functions will kind of survive and still have a place in the market, and others might fall empty. I'm sure this is a major concern for many, many landlords as well, looking forward. And then also a little bit alarming is that for many, poor information and data access is significant. So again, it seems we have not really covered the technology game as of yet to the full extent, and there's still things that can and could be done.
So I think to kind of wrap up this first section, essentially what we're finding from kind of these sets of questions, the theme that we're finding is that there were firms sort of tackling this uncertainty around their real estate strategy. So they they kind of understood that or they believed that there would be more unassigned spaces in their offices in the future, and they were implementing a lot more flexible working and hybrid working models. But they were also still trying to get employees back into the office as much as they could, and they viewed kind of flexible working itself as a challenge to them achieving their business initiatives and kind of business success. So I think what this kind of showed, sort of particularly harking back to the question we saw earlier about why the views have changed, is with context changing, there is still a lot of uncertainty for firms about how to deal with this kind of transition, and also what the office looks like in the future. And that's what we really saw through these kind of questions.
Yeah.
So I think the next section we wanted to look at, or the next kind of set of questions and insights we want to go through, are looking at kind of return to work strategies in particular. So the first section was really around the high level view of executives and businesses, but we also asked respondents about their actual return to work strategies, what they found successful, what difficulties they faced, and so on. So when we asked respondents about the challenges they were met with when sort of implementing their return to work strategies, there were two sort of key hurdles that were seen most often when attracting employees back to the office. And one was actually attracting them back to the office in a sort of a full fashion, so getting a good number of them back into the office, so that it was sort of feasible both economically and viable for them to kind of keep the office open. And then once those employees were back in those spaces, ensuring that their satisfaction and their kind of employee experience was sufficient for them to kind of want to be in the office. And part of that is kind of company culture as well. So I think this highlighted kind of a gap where firms were not trying hard enough to understand their kind of employee sentiments, or they're finding difficulties in kind of understanding what employees wanted. And the importance of kind of understanding what your employees want is really in that. So you kind of redesign your workspaces or your workplaces and develop your strategies around working in a way that's conducive to what they want to see, because that will kind of help with employee satisfaction, will help with kind of employee retention, which are sort of initiatives that a lot of firms do have. But then those factors sort of feed into some of those more important initiatives that we saw earlier on, like building business resiliency, enabling collaboration, and most importantly, kind of business productivity and performance. So I think that those were some of the those were the two kind of key challenges we saw. And then you can see here some examples of some of the strategies we saw firms were using to encourage a return to the office. So this included kind of incentivization, such as free food in the canteen, free kind of beverages, programs around healthy lifestyles, things like yoga and gym memberships or gym access. We also saw, as we've kind of already discussed, the implementation of more hybrid working, so that it's kind of an optionality thing where you can come to the office. We saw examples of firms implementing more technologies, and this was to try and improve the employee experience when people are actually in the office. And we also heard from respondents that they were focusing on improving the communication with employees for greater kind of engagement. And what kind of this myriad of different responses shows is that firms are really still at the early stage of the post-pandemic in terms of recovery and getting back to the office. And so they're really trying to work out what works best for them in their specific context. And this we kind of will speak to a little bit throughout this presentation, is why it's important to understand what employees want in your particular context. But what we're seeing right now is that quite a range of different methodologies and kind of tactics and sort of tools and incentives are being used to try and get people back into the office.
And we are seeing a lot of actions being taken, and I'm not saying that it's necessarily bad, but I don't see to the same extent really an investigation on the question of why, and not really necessarily why would people want to come to the office, but the question for the organizations to say, why do you want them at the office? Is that only for productivity, and is that really a valid reason for employees to be there? So give them the why as well that you're pondering about.
And so the kind of last key insight we got from asking about kind of workplace strategies was understanding what firms are using to kind of measure their success. And what we saw is that firms are placing kind of a wider focus on a more diverse range of metrics than target occupancy, which is typically what you would expect to see as kind of the kind of benchmark or the litmus test for success. So most firms stated that target occupancy is no longer kind of their primary metric of focus, with a lot more attention on some other factors such as worker safety or productivity, which kind of mirrors some of the key priorities that were highlighted earlier on. And firms, by kind of looking at these other metrics, will start giving themselves a better chance of kind of meeting those employee needs by measuring other factors that are more conducive to successful working and successful collaboration, and then sort of increasing the technology around that as well to kind of support that process. So one interesting quote we got from the interviews was that one respondent said people are coming to the office for different reasons. They want to come in to collaborate and not just sort of sit on Microsoft Teams. So they want to work on the stuff that's best done face to face, and that's why that particular firm view what people are doing as more important now, or as important as sort of just focusing on total occupancy, because it's really about not using presence as a proxy for productivity, but actually measuring in a more granular level, in a more detailed fashion, what the factors are that contribute to productivity, or kind of the employee experience, which in turn helps contribute to productivity, for example.
Yeah, well, I, again, still was recently at an event where there was a presentation made around a new build project, or a refurbishment, actually, where they were bragging with their marvelous occupancy numbers after refurbishment, claiming that they had 80% average utilization now, which already got me thinking. And then they said, which is above 60% average in London. And when asked whether that was right now, they said it was, which left really high doubts in my mind about that, because I cannot imagine that average occupancy would be 60% at the moment. It was hardly 60% before the pandemic on average. Peak it might be, but average I don't really buy into. I hear we might still have the sound issue. If somebody could tell me if that's still the case, because then, Dayann, I'm going to move you to the next slide and disappear again for a moment to see if it helps if I go out and in again. So if somebody can give me a little hint whether that's still a problem or not, then I'll try to fix it by leaving you.
Okay, so I will take over for the next few slides. Hopefully Sabine will be back. Yeah, so the next thing we wanted to look at actually was kind of understanding. So executives understand that creating workplace policies and spaces that better support employee needs and desires adds more value to kind of their kind of basic functionality and bottom line. And we saw that firms are beginning to kind of turn to technology to better understand the different patterns of behavior that their employees are sort of displaying. And this will also help kind of this technology and kind of understanding all of this will help design more effective workspaces and activities around what the employee experience. So this is what we sort of are going to dive into in this next section. So you can see here that firms have been rolling out contactless workplace and collaboration tools as kind of the most prominent technology investment in the last also sort of post-COVID. Kind of an interesting point to highlight here, I think it's the fifth line item, is that space monitoring and utilization is an area that is set to see a lot of investment. And this is really important because this is where firms can really give themselves a good level of baseline and foundational knowledge about what their employees want and how their employees are acting. So by having technologies in place around space monitoring and utilization, they can understand the kind of demands and trends that employees are putting on the office, and kind of adjusting the office design and the office workspaces based on that. So understanding different working patterns. And I think one thing that we'll kind of emphasize a lot later on as well is that by having these tools in place, firms can really understand this in a much more dynamic fashion. So if you're monitoring this on a regular basis, it's not a case of just putting in one strategy. Like we mentioned, we are seeing that some of the priorities and the kind of focus points have changed even in the last year or so. And so what might have been important, what might have been important last year might not be the same this year. And in the same way, how employees are working, how they were working last year, where maybe they were less keen to come into the office, and maybe now they're more keen to come into the office because very simplistically it might mean they don't have to run the heating at home, right? And so to get an understanding of those kinds of trends, having the space and workplace space monitoring and utilization tools in place to understand your workplaces is really important. And I think here we can see something that's quite important. So we saw earlier that employee satisfaction is at times overlooked, if you remember the kind of business priorities graph early on. But firms really are feeling the pressure of kind of employees leaving the organization or moving to sort of competitors and so on. And so they are looking to kind of react with better hybrid policies and technology investments. So more than half of firms said they are changing their working policies for more hybrid working. More than half also said they are looking to new workplace technologies to track employee data. So there is a kind of a kick up the backside for firms to understand that they need to be a lot more on the ball to make sure that they don't start losing their sort of best employees and their workforce in the near future. And here you'll see a graph around kind of the metrics being used for measuring sort of performance of the business in general. So you can see that currently collection of utilization data, so desk and resource utilization data, is actually quite poor. And that makes it really hard for firms to build kind of an accurate image of what the organization is going through. So you'll see that 40% say they only collect desk and resource utilization metrics on an occasional basis, and another 24% say they do not collect, but they plan to. But that does mean that almost 2/3 of firms currently don't collect this data on a regular basis. And this means that it's really hard for firms and organizations to keep up with employee demands in a dynamic fashion. So like I said, what employees might be feeling can change on a week-to-week, a month-to-month basis. There might be different factors that are influencing that. And it takes a long time for these organizations who don't have these tools in place to understand those trends and those changes when they're not measuring it on a regular level. So this is something that really needs to be improved on, given the kind of state of flux that a lot of workplace demands are in at the moment. As a step in kind of the right direction, you will see that 59% of firms do not currently, but plan to collect engagement and collaboration metrics. So I think there is an understanding that for kind of both desk and resource utilization metrics and number of engagement metrics, that firms are looking to spend money in this space, but there is still a lag in terms of if a lot of firms have put in these workplace strategies, they seem to have done it in somewhat of a sort of translucent fashion where they haven't had all the information that could have helped them with those decisions.
I haven't really chipped in before because I was afraid the mic was not good. I've hooked up the device again. Again, let me know if I should try and reload again. I wanted to add here. Oh, all good now. Great. Let's cross our fingers that it'll stay like that for the rest of the webinar. At least I know now the heck of what to do, switching microphone outlets all the time. That the top three are kind of classical FM stack of energy efficiency, environmental data, access control, kind of the basics that you should always have, and maybe a little bit topical with energy prices rising as well. I think we have a question around external challenges as well that I would go back to in the end. And something that I thought about when we were looking at the earlier slide, I'm going to move us back actually, was we're looking, when we talk about employee experience, and we are asking workplace practitioners, so it's only natural they will come up with workplace strategies to address that. But the bigger problem could be that employee experience is very much shaped at the core by things that are not workplace and space in particular, but that are your work itself. So the content of your work and your colleagues and your compensation, your working hours, your flexibility. And then it is the collaboration with your colleagues. If you are working on an eye level, if you get appreciation, all of these things before it even comes to space playing a role in employee experience. Because I hardly find people saying, "Ooh, I took this no job because they have this great office," or "I didn't take this job because they have a horrible office." Actually, that was my case. I once worked in a really horrible office, and I did it because I wanted to do the job. So hinting a bit at, there's a really big need to look beyond space and collaborate more with HR. I know you're all trying to do that and that it's not easy, but that's just something to keep in mind when we get lost in our space strategy, that there is really other important elements that we're kind of working against as limitations of what we're doing. Because you can put out the most beautiful office in the world with the best amenities and technology, but then if the tasks and content of the job are not satisfactory, it's not going to help. Sorry, Dayann, that was a little bit of a rant. I'll move us back to the next slide.
So yeah, so I think this is potentially the last sort of data-driven slide we have, and it's just looking at the sort of distribution of some of those performance metrics that we looked at in the previous graph. So here you can see that sort of apart from building and facility managers, less than a fifth of every stakeholder group actually has access to the performance measurement data on a daily or weekly basis. So other stakeholders within the organization really don't have any view into how well the business is performing across these metrics. You know, what is driving kind of success, and that really means they can't get involved in strategy development in a kind of informed fashion. And that in turn basically means that a lot of the policies that are being incorporated and enforced around sort of workplace, for example, are formulated in a very narrow manner where only one stakeholder, and it might just be that stakeholder that makes those decisions, but the one stakeholder, sort of building or facility managers, they're the ones kind of formulating those strategies. And I think this really emphasizes the need for different groups to have access to that data and then be able to leverage that data in a kind of collaborative fashion, so that the kind of each of these different areas work together to better respond to sort of both employee and business needs. You get a much better balance of maximizing the employee experience and achieving your business initiatives and being productive when you have kind of all these different stakeholder groups involved in the development of that strategy, but all these stakeholder groups also being privy to the same amount of information. So they might be able to provide kind of different reasons for why something's not working, and different perspectives on how maybe you can go about tackling that. And that really emphasizes the kind of opportunity that, you know, a lot of these firms spoke about the possibility of or encouraging collaboration in the workforce, but this demonstrates that even within the organization in themselves, these different departments are not collaborating enough to be kind of strategically strong. So I think there's what this really showed is that there's no or there's not enough kind of distribution.
I would even go back a step and say it would be helpful to have different set of eyes on data, because you might be driven again in a workplace mind towards certain interpretation of data, whereas somebody else might see something very different and identify a different lever that you weren't even thinking about.
So yeah, to kind of wrap up this section, what we kind of found is that for firms to kind of avoid a lot of departures in their organization, the loss of kind of workforce talent and knowledge drain within their organization, they need to better collect and incorporate data and employee feedback. And to do that, you'll need investment or focus around some of the key technologies, and then also share that data to all the different business departments, so that everyone's kind of on the same page and pulling in the right direction to maximize both the employee experience, but also some of those other factors that are really key, such as business productivity. And that in turn will, that level of collaboration will help sort of boost the performance in both those areas, help with business resiliency, help with general collaboration as well. And so it does mean that the organization is working in a much more cohesive fashion. And so I think that's kind of the key message we got out some of those insights. So I think the last thing we wanted to cover is just some of the steps that firms can take to overcome the kind of uncertainty around office spaces and what the value is that office spaces have. So firstly, a lot of firms did say they have some form of data, right? So it's really about using what you've already spent money on and using that in a lot better fashion. So understanding some of the working preferences and the patterns that you're seeing, and really actually using that data to empathize with your employees. So this is really vital in terms of talent retention of employees in the short term. But it can also help towards kind of incorporating the best policies around the workplace experience in the long term as well. So I think this is kind of a valuable step for a lot of firms to take, because it's an investment you've already kind of made, but just making sure you're getting the maximum value out of that in terms of your current infrastructure. And then once you kind of do that, you'll get an understanding of where there might be some gaps in kind of your data collection, and where you might have some gaps in your sort of general understanding of the business and what employees want and how employees are acting, for example. And so once you've kind of deciphered where those gaps are, it's really on the firm to kind of focus in on collecting more targeted data in those areas. And this data will help drive more kind of value-based space utilization and kind of office space use, rather than maintaining kind of more traditional focus on mere density. And that's not to say that you shouldn't still be measuring density, because obviously there are key factors that come into play with density. So understanding you don't have too much space or too little space and so on, but just making sure you have a good range of data sets to sort of build a more complete picture. And I think one kind of really important thing that we've already mentioned, but I'll kind of reiterate here, is sharing this targeted data with sort of different stakeholders. But part of that is also sharing it with landlords for lease spaces can be quite beneficial, because you might get to a point where both you and the landlord have an understanding of how the spaces are being used, and you might be able to identify places where there might be opportunities to invest. And by kind of identifying that together, you might be able to kind of co-share in that investment, because there's a benefit for you, because you get better use out of your spaces, you deliver a better employee experience, and for the landlord themselves, they might get better occupancy and a kind of a longer term relationship with you. And even if for example you might move, that's the kind of tool that might be able to attract the next tenant in as well. So it's really about kind of building those relationships there. We also spoke about kind of the just then about distribution to landlords, but also general distribution to the wider organization is highly, highly important. So the combined perspectives will really help create better decision making and strategies around workplaces and real estate, and also a lot more successful implementation of policies as well. So once sort of HR is aware of a certain thing, IT is aware of a certain thing, they'll be able to support in the best fashion what the kind of key goals of that a workplace policy is during implementation. So I think that's really important. And sort of tied to that is making sure that the data is collected on a much more frequent basis, because as much as you can, you want to regularly or sort of continuously collect this data, because you can build a much more accurate picture of the kind of dynamic working place and understand changes in a much more responsive fashion. And that way, you can build better resiliency into the business if something happens. For example, if a lot of people start working from home, then you will have an understanding of that in a much more in a much quicker fashion, and then you can see how best to respond to that. And then I think the final thing here is that to build a much more complete picture, you collect all this data and you should dynamically respond to kind of your employee needs. But it's really about iterating that sort of policy development. So it's not a case of you invest in all these technologies, you kind of build a snapshot of how your employees are working in sort of November 2022, and then you implement a strategy. It's about really maintaining that flexibility. So the strategy you put in place for November 2022 might be very different to the strategy your business requires in March 2023, for example. And by regularly kind of checking in on that data and iterating your strategies around your workplace based on that, you'll be able to better sort of meet the needs of your employees, but also stay on top of kind of the different contextual matters that might impact your business. So you remain more agile as an organization to the different challenges that you might face.
Yeah, this is all very easy said and not that easy done, especially if you're working in a large organization and have to get a lot of stakeholders all under one hat and work with concerns of IT security and workers' council and data privacy and all these things. We do have some questions to get more concrete towards data and technology. One is, what technologies would be good investments to support the transition in the workplace?
Yeah, I mean, Sabine, you probably have some views to this as well, but I think we mentioned sort of technologies around space and sort of resource utilization. That's always useful to understand kind of the different trends. I think tools that might be able to support the employees as well. So mobile focused tools, that's a good way to help both kind of improve the employee experience, but also engage with employees. So it can help with sort of communication, but also understanding how they work and so on. I think those can be good investments. And I think potentially tools to measure kind of usage of amenities, things like that will also be sort of very helpful in understanding how people are using their different resources. I guess it's very much business dependent and kind of strategy dependent as well. But there's probably sort of two key arcs to look at. One set of tools to measure how things are going around performance and usage, for example, and then another set of tools around actually improving the employee experience. And I think there should be a focus on both. But they should be linked so that you kind of have the employee experience tools and then you have ways to measure how that's impacting employee experience, for example.
Yeah. A route that we have taken in a research project we're doing with the University of Applied Sciences in Zurich is, and that's more going into data than really technology, which is another question, was an approach to take together space utilization data, employee feedback data that was collected circumstantial and not like only annually from afar, but really on site to the group that was in that workplace. And then also really noting very detailed the specifications of the workplace and then bringing those three together to draw conclusions from that. So Dayann, in terms of the data question we had here, because we went into a little bit of like what are classical data sets to collect that all the companies or most of the companies actually have. So the question we have here is, what are some of the less traditional workplace data sets to go after?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think some of them might have been listed there, but like I said, desk and resource utilization will be a good starting point just for monitoring. I personally think data on so there are solutions that offer the ability to kind of identify hotspots in a building, so sort of footfall or where people might be kind of spending their time, and that those kind of data points, so they might provide heat maps, for example. Those kind of data points can be really helpful with workplace redesigns. So understanding, maybe you have amenities, you might have two sets of amenities on one floor, but only one of them is being one sort of area is being used a lot, and that might be because the workplace design is poor, or it might be just because you don't need that much. But having that data in place would really help. So that kind of data would also be helpful. I think I mentioned kind of usage of amenities, so data around that as well, maybe sort of more numerical data in that sense. I think that would also be quite helpful in understanding, just building quite a complete picture of what how sort of different elements or resources are being used. And then I also think it's probably quite important to get qualitative data from employees on general feedback. And I think this is where working with the likes of HR can be really helpful, because they might be able to they'll know ways of quantifying that data or presenting that data in a sort of tangible fashion, rather than just words on a page, for example. So I think that kind of information would also be very helpful, and it might be quite difficult to capture that otherwise. But working with HR can support that or facilitate that process.
Yeah, I was going to say it might be less traditional for workplace teams, but really traditional for HR teams to collect offboarding surveys and comments and these kind of things that could have helpful information as well to look into really. Now, I do want to go back to the question that I mentioned before. That was besides quotation marks, these internal limitations, what is your outlook on workplace transition with the world actually still being in crisis and a lot of uncertainty around things like the economy, we mentioned before, energy prices, climate change, all these sort of external challenges and the continued uncertainty? What do we make out of that?
Yes, I guess this is harking on a little bit more of our research at Verdantix and maybe some of the stuff we've heard, and maybe some of your views have been less so on the actual study we did here. But I think in terms of external challenges, the sustainability and kind of climate change challenge is growing rapidly. So there is a lot of emphasis for firms to incorporate a lot more sustainability and ESG focus into their sort of corporate sustainability agenda. And part of that will also be how they operate as an organization in terms of workplace strategies. So looking for buildings that are much more energy efficient, much more sustainable. And I think that will be part of what landlords will have to focus on as well. So having buildings that are both ESG and sustainable and eco-friendly, but also that deliver a kind of progressive kind of workplace or a good employee experience. In terms of the economy and energy prices, I think that is, I guess that's more short term, or like sort of on our doorstep, that we're kind of maybe at the cliff edge at the moment. And I think the impact of that will be that firms may, and we saw in some of the answers, that firms may start focusing a little bit more on the optimization element of it rather than employee satisfaction element of things. For example, we saw that, I think Sabine, you mentioned last year, a lot more people were saying that space efficiency would be about comfort and employee satisfaction, and now it seems like it'll be more about actual optimization, which in turn would be more efficient spaces that are more cost effective, right? So I think the economy and energy prices will perhaps put some things that are employee centric, such as satisfaction, a little bit down the sort of pecking order for a short while, just because firms will be looking to sort of navigate the immediate threat that high energy prices and the kind of damaged economy will pose to them. But I think that's perhaps more immediate, more short term, and then climate change and sustainability will be a lot more significant in the long term. And firms are trying to bed that in as much as they can into their general strategies.
Yeah, I want to say, in fact, our realities have not really changed ever, because portfolio optimization has always been and will always be a topic that corporate real estate and FM organizations will have a look at. And sometimes it's more important because the company is not doing that well or the economy is not that well. And sometimes it's a little less important because you're on the height of the curve. And the same basically, actually, already during the pandemic, I got sometimes really mad when people were saying, oh, the future is uncertain now. Well, the future never has been certain. That's the characteristics of the future, that you don't know. We've just been very ignorant in thinking things will always stay the same. So we've always dealt with uncertainties, and corporate real estate has always had to be on top of their portfolio to be able to execute certain strategies in whatever direction they might go. So always having to be agile and on the tiptoes to see where optimization would occur, or what places would be the best to use going forward for employee productivity and satisfaction. So in fact, it has not really changed, and it will not really change. Our tasks in its fundamental elements is still the same. I know this is not very helpful or hopeful outlook maybe, but it is true. I'm sorry. One more question that we currently have is, what are some of the biggest mistakes around setting up for workplace in transition? And that's actually, I think, a really interesting one.
Yeah, that is a very good question. I think the thing that comes to mind is probably firms thinking that it's a sort of a one and done process. So it's not, as we mentioned, it's not a case of you collect this data, you take a snapshot, you make a decision, and then you enforce it, and that's it. It's very much a dynamic thing. So that means not implementing something too quickly and not implementing something too slowly, but making sure you kind of have a continuous process around it. It's the same way as, it's the same as kind of growing a business, right? You're not looking to grow immediately. You're trying to grow in a sustainable fashion. There are very few businesses that sort of can sustain a massive amount of growth very quickly. And I think that's something that when firms are trying to transition, it's not a case of, like you said, the future is always uncertain, right? So essentially you might always be in transition. It's just because given the sort of level of disruption that we've seen in the last 2 years and maybe in the next year or so as well, that level of transition is greater than what perhaps previously we'd seen in the, say, even the 10 years before that. What you're trying to do is you're trying to set yourself up so you can navigate that without kind of knowing the question at the moment. You want to be able to answer the question at that time, depending on what the question is, and by sort of putting in the technologies to monitor and to understand, that's what you're essentially doing. I think a mistake would be to try and think you can solve the issue in one go, and then not sort of continuously revisit that to make sure that you are still solving the problem, and the problem is still the same even. So I think that's probably the biggest mistake, is trying to do it all in one go without having that dynamism in the organization.
Yeah, I'd say not only trying to do it only in one go, but also like asking for qualitative employee feedback and thinking that this insights you gain from there is going to be valid and true forever, because people change, and it's probably something we will have to look more at retail And shop displays, for example, they don't put in shop displays once and then they stay there forever. They change customer experience along with taste of people, seasons, what's currently the trendiest color. And I'm not suggesting to change the colors in the office every quarter, but saying if you ask people today, do you want to be in the office, yes or no, their question might be very different now than it is in 3 months, because again, their personal situation might have changed. They might have different priorities, a different place that they live in, different commute, different tasks, different projects that we're working on. So yeah, that would be another thing that, again, we will not never tie employee feedback down and have the answer to what people like once and for all. It's going to be in flux as well. So yeah, you're probably right, Dayann. We will most likely always be in transition. Now, I'm being mindful of time. This was the last question as well that we had so far. I would close it now. I think Dayann, both and me are open. If anybody have questions, connect with us on LinkedIn or send me an email afterwards at Locatee. We can take a look at that. Download the study if you haven't yet. And otherwise, I thank you very much for taking the time and joining us today. And thank you, Dayann, for hosting with me as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.